History is filled with gambles. Great leaders often risk everything on a single roll of the dice. In the summer of 1812, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte made the biggest gamble of his life. He decided to invade Russia. He gathered the largest European army ever seen. It was called the Grande Armée. Over 500,000 men from across his vast empire were assembled. They were confident. They were victorious. Austerlitz, Wagram. Now, they were poised to strike at the heart of the great Russian bear. This was no ordinary army. It was a multinational force. French veterans, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutchmen. They brought with them thousands of cannons, endless wagons of supplies. Napoleon believed in speed and decisive battle. His plan was simple and brutal. He would push deep into Russia, force Tsar Alexander I into a massive winner-takes-all fight. The grand battle Napoleon craved never came. The Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly, Mikhail Kutuzov, knew they could not defeat the Grande Armée in a head-on collision. So they chose a different strategy. Painful, frustrating, brilliant. They retreated. As the Russians retreated, they employed a scorched-earth policy. They burned their own villages. They destroyed their crops. They poisoned the wells. Napoleon's army was designed to live off the land, to move fast and forage for food. But in Russia, there was nothing to forage. The soldiers found empty towns and blackened fields. Hunger and disease, particularly dysentery, spread like wildfire. Thousands of men and horses died without ever seeing a single Russian soldier. The Grande Armée was bleeding strength with every mile. Napoleon grew increasingly frustrated. His swift campaign was turning into a slow, agonizing slog. He pushed his men harder. There were battles, vicious and bloody clashes like Smolensk and later Borodino. 1 week after the carnage at Borodino, Napoleon rode into Moscow. He expected to find a city humbled, ready to surrender. Instead, he found an eerie silence. Moscow was a ghost town. Almost all of its 300,000 residents had fled, taking their possessions. The great city, its golden domes and magnificent palaces, was empty, a hollow prize. There was no one to surrender, no one to negotiate with. That very night, fires broke out across the city. At first, the French assumed they were accidents, but soon, fires were erupting everywhere. It became clear this was deliberate. Fyodor Rostopchin had ordered Moscow to be burned. Arsenals, granaries, stockpiles of food set ablaze. The flames, fanned by the wind, grew into a monstrous firestorm that engulfed the wooden city. Napoleon could only watch in horror from the Kremlin as his great prize was reduced to a blackened ruin. The fire destroyed buildings and the shelters and supplies they desperately needed. Soldiers looted and salvaged what little they could find. They were hundreds of miles from home in a hostile land with a vengeful army lurking nearby, and winter was coming. Napoleon lingered in the ashes of Moscow for over a month. He waited. He hoped for a message from St. Petersburg. None came. The silence was absolute. As October began, the first snowflakes started to fall. A sense of dread crept in. The time for waiting was over. On October 19th, Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat. The Grande Armée, laden with plunder, was desperately short on food. They planned a more southerly route, but the resurgent Russian army blocked them. They were forced back onto the same devastated road. A death sentence. They marched through a wasteland they helped create. No food, no water, no shelter. And winter was coming. The Russian winter of 1812 was brutally cold. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Icicles clung to gear. Breath froze in the air. Gun oil froze solid. Frostbite. Fingers, toes, noses turned black and rotted away. Many huddled and froze in their sleep. Equipment failed. Hands were too numb to load muskets. Hunger tormented them. They ate whatever they could find, even slaughtering their horses. They boiled harness leather, drank horse blood for warmth. There were even stories, whispered, of cannibalism. Discipline collapsed. The Grande Armée became a desperate mob. The weak were left behind to die. Cossacks and partisans harried the column. They struck and vanished. The crossing of the Berezina was a nightmare. Russians closed in as makeshift bridges were built. Bridges collapsed. Thousands died or drowned in the icy water. It was pure horror and desperation. The retreat was a vision of death. Every man for himself. General Winter had taken his toll. The retreat from Russia was one of the greatest military disasters in history. Of the more than 500,000 men who marched east in June, fewer than 30,000 stumbled back across the Niemen in December. The rest were gone. They died in battle, from starvation, from disease, and from the merciless cold. The Grande Armée, the instrument of Napoleon's power, had been utterly destroyed. It was a loss on an unimaginable scale. Napoleon would never truly recover. News of the disaster spread like wildfire. Crushed nations saw their chance. Prussia turned against him. Austria soon followed. Britain poured money and arms into the new coalition. The War of the Sixth Coalition erupted. Napoleon raised new conscripts. He could replace men but not the thousands of trained horses and lost equipment. In 1813, the war in Germany culminated at Leipzig, a decisive defeat by Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. This defeat drove him back into France. Momentum had shifted completely. Allied armies entered Paris in 1814. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. He returned for the 100 Days in 1815, but his power base was gone. Waterloo was the epilogue. Russia was the tragic climax. The shocking reason for his failure was not a single battle nor a clever enemy general. It was his own hubris. He underestimated the vastness of the land and the resilience of its people, and the terrifying power of its greatest defender, General Winter.